So lapel is for your presenter, stick mic is your MC, and your question.
And Jay will do MC and question.
You'll have to walk around.
Okay, everybody, welcome. Gosh, I love the Midwest. 5 minutes early is 10 minutes late here, and this room has been full since 3:10. And thanks to everyone joining us online. I know a lot of people for homecoming couldn't make it back, but they're joining in virtually. So welcome to you on your computer screens back at home. I'm Jay Sexton. For those who don't know me, this is homecoming. This is homecoming, and this is something that Mizzou does really, really good. Wait. Started homecoming? Is that did someone just say that? That's what they say. And it's fantastic about how homecoming is like the institution which brings people back to Mizzou. And I think that non-academic units at Mizzou have really capitalized on this. The football team, obviously, student groups, sororities, religious groups. Like, this is the big weekend for them. And it's something that academic units should take advantage of as well, because at the end of the day, we're a university, and that's why everybody's here. So it's wonderful to welcome so many of our former students here that I've been talking to, and our alumni, friends, and supporters, and also the mother of our speaker, who I'm about to introduce, Julie. Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see you. Oh, wait, what's new? The pulpit. The pulpit. You might remember the pulpit was rolled in up to the 4th floor about a year ago. We gave a sort of premature kind of christening and inauguration of the pulpit. It soon fell apart shortly after it. I bought this for $80 at a garage sale. It apparently, this is what was told to me, and it's one of those stories that's too good to actually look into it to see if it's true, that this was a longtime pulpit at a small Anglican chapel in North Missouri. So that's what we're going with, true or not. But it's been refurbished. It's fantastic. Like all revolutions, what's notable is with something new, the old doesn't always get pushed out right away. So we still have the old. It will eventually get phased out. But it's fantastic that the first speaker for the pulpit today, and here I'm introducing our speaker, is none other than Jeff Pasley. Let's give him a round of applause right away. And before I tell you about Jeff and what he's researched and where he's been, let me just say that this institution, the weekly colloquia in 410 Jesse Hall, which I think is the heart and soul of the Kinder Institute, most important thing we do every week, is right here. It's building an intellectual community. The founder of the whole thing was Jeff, so it's perfect that he gets to inaugurate the new pulpit. Jeff Pasley, a graduate of Topeka West High School. We'll start there. I was told there'd be no fact-checking for speakers. I've thought that for 8 years, and I swear we've talked about it. But I was thinking, next to Topeka West is Washburn Rural High School, for any Kansans in the audience. And he left Eastern Kansas, went to Carleton, don't say McAllister, went to Carleton in Minnesota, had a little brief interlude that you should ask him about after the lecture over drinks, where we entered the world of journalism, politics, and then came to his senses and came back to study of history, went to Harvard, studied Bernard Bailey, wrote a fantastic dissertation, became his first book, went to, his first job was in, or his first permanent job was at Florida State in Tallahassee, and then came back home to the Midwest in 1999 at the University of Missouri, where he's been ever since, and as they say, a co-founder of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy back in 2015. Now, what does Jeff do? I would say Jeff is not just a, but the leader in the study of early American political culture. He was one of a group of historians of his generation that began to change the way that we thought about early politics, moving away from the study of high statesmen, of presidents, and of secretaries of state and so forth, and thinking about the more complex, rich, diverse world in which political culture was formed and in which political initiatives and change was founded. He had a particular interest, which was in the interest of newspapers, pamphlets, and argued that actually here was where the early forms of democracy could best be identified, not with the speeches of elite statesmen, but what was happening in the press world, in the commercial as well as the political world of early newspapers. That was his first book, The Tyranny of the Printers. He took that idea into new directions with his second book on the election of 1796. He calls it the first U.S. presidential election, one in which we see a multitude of actors beyond just the candidates themselves, and one in which we see actually the ways in which early U.S. politics was influenced by events and processes from outside of the United States, the French Revolution and the British press, the Irish press, as well as that in the United States. So that's Jeff, and that's what he's known for. That's his fastball and his curveball, politics, cultural history of politics. But today we're going to get his changeup. Today we're going to get his changeup, the new project, which is taking us to this area, the heartland, the contested borderlands of the Missouri and Kansas rivers in the mid-19th century. He calls this project his Western, which we all look forward to hearing a preview of tonight. Can we give Jeff Pazzi a big round of applause? Welcome, Jeff.
To turn that on. Oh yeah, it's loud. That's loud. Okay, thanks, Jay. Wow, how do I follow that up? This is a change up, though. It's not as much of a change up because I think everybody from Kansas who becomes a historian probably started out with this border war stuff. It's at least at some level, because that's kind of like unless you're really into winter wheat. It's kind of the main history thing we had going in Kansas, though I never heard about this, but it was always something I was interested in and was glad to get a chance to come back to. And I'll just say, I don't know if I remember to say this in here, it does go along with my other stuff in the sense that it's still great events from the perspective of people you don't think of necessarily, from the history. We used to say about one of the edited volumes I did called Beyond the Founders about new perspectives as of 20 years ago on the politics of the early republic. We used to talk about history in the middle from the middle out. Says not the masses, not those statesmen, but kind of everything that happened in between. And this is also a very in between thing. But I better get started on it because this is like a first time I've ever given a formal presentation on this, even though I've kind of been thinking about it for 20 years, and I try to get this down to a reasonable length, but you see it goes in many different directions, so I better get started. So I first ran across this story in the town where my parents hadn't thanked my mom for coming today. I first ran across the story in the town where my parents happened to be living when we first moved back here, and that is Weston, north of Kansas City. It's one of the oldest and oldest looking towns on the western Missouri River. Weston was keen to attract tourists, it still is keen to attract tourists with its historic surroundings, yet it had a problem with not really wanting to share any of its actual history. Because it turns out that Weston was where one of so-called border ruffians lived, the kind of masterminds of the whole thing. That smiley dude, Benjamin Stringfellow there being one of them. He's just thinking about what else he can do to further slavery today. What else he can do, these are the guys who organized the secret blue lodges to drive people out of Missouri who were not considered sound on the goose. That was their code for slavery. If you weren't sound on the goose, that meant, or the goose question, that was referring to slavery. They coordinated periodic Missourian invasions of Kansas to vote in their elections and harassed northern settlers, and founded the town of Atchison as a pro-slavery center, and much, much worse, to be honest. So I wrote an article back then, thanks to a former student of mine. I wrote an article about Weston for Historic Preservation magazine, where I was trying to make the argument, which they didn't follow, that people should highlight their bad history as well as their good. I still think that's a cool idea, but it's hard to sell to the towns. In the process of digging up dirt, so to speak, on Weston, I happened to read the story of Dr. John Doy, a Kansas, and as it was presented, a Kansas abolitionist who was kidnapped in 1859 and almost lynched in the middle of Weston's town hall. After several other brushes with death in various other Missouri dungeons, as he called it, got put on trial in St. Joseph for slave stealing with the national press in attendance. Then just as he was about to be sent to the Jefferson City Penitentiary for life, he got busted out by a band of Kansas jayhawkers. So I should put that out. I should have put that there because this is where you can see where Weston and these various other places. Now I'm not supposed to touch the mouse, but I did it anyway. I touched the mouse. There's Weston, and of course here's the other place we're going to be talking about, Lawrence. Though it's Lawrence in the middle of a bunch of places that no longer exist on the map. When they got back to Lawrence, the group posed for group photo. They posed for a photo shoot so there could be a picture that people could keep as a keepsake or hang on their wall. So there's the version you could hang on your wall with a little put out by a Boston publisher with a special key so you could remember who all your heroes are. This is very helpful for me. I actually have this up on my wall next to my desk at home, so I can trying to remember who everyone is, though it's not altogether right. But you see, the last act of the Kansas drama, they wish it was the last act of the Kansas drama, because if you know the history of Kansas, 1859 is a mid-date as opposed to a final date. And then here's I don't remember why I did that. Let me see if I'm not sure this is going to work. I think I had the keepsake. Yeah, all right. I'm blaming the tech guy on the fact that I have some links that were internal to my computer that I'm not on my computer. So there was a keepsake version, like a version that in this kind of carrying case, and you can see that original picture on the front of the presentation was one of the kind of frames they had it in. So anyway, it was a big deal at the time, and something that many souvenirs of were published, were created. If their friend, there's John Brown, just extremely realistic version of John Brown there, as we see him in Kansas. If their friend John Brown had not stolen the headlines just after this with an even more spectacular blow against the slave power at Harper's Ferry, we might well look back on the Doy Rescue rather than Harper's Ferry as the key precursor to the Civil War. So, why had I never heard of this? Sounded like a movie, a Western, only one where the gun-toting heroes were people you could root for. Anti-slavery activists rather than the kind of ex-Confederate soldiers that John Wayne and Clint Eastwood always played. So sign me up. I started gathering more information about it in my spare time. Of course, as Jay went over, really didn't have a lot of spare time for quite a few years. Many other projects on the front burner, including classes and all these other books and this little thing called the Kinder Institute. So I didn't get to it for a while. And one person who did get to it was, I think he's watching, my son Isaac, who lives in Kansas City, who loves to read old newspapers and visit weird libraries for fun. We'll drive over to Topeka to look up something in the State Historical Society for like an hour, as long as he gets to go to water parks or other things he likes to do. So he'd been working on it more than I had for a long time, and eventually the fact that Isaac had done so much on the Doi case prompted me to do so as well. So when my first research leave in many years came up last year, it seemed like a time to actually get this book project happening. So easier said than done, as always. Because it turns out that the saga of John Doe and the Immortal Ten, it might be more of a miniseries than just Western film. One Western film, if HBO is watching, that is. About 3 seasons, I think I see it as. The story leads in so many different directions, covering so many aspects of the Kansas frontier experience and well beyond that. To take just a few of the Immortal Ten and the themes their stories raise, we've got, all right, let's see if this works. Spent quite a long time trying to figure out how to do this. All right, so there's the guys. There we go. There's theme 1, arms smuggling and technology, in the form of their team leader, Major James B. Abbott. Originally a shoemaker from Massachusetts and Connecticut, who settled in Kansas, and then when the going got tough, traveled back to Connecticut to bring a cannon and several crates of advanced Sharps rifles back to defend Lawrence, which he got directly from the manufacturer, where he knew people. And, he smuggled a cannon. This is pretty good, too. These guns were light, fast, and accurate enough for a Yankee schoolmaster or shoemaker to lie down in the grass and make a lot of trouble for onrushing drunken Missourians on horseback, right? So, don't try to hold on to your beer and rush somebody with a Sharps rifle, because it didn't go well for a lot of people. All right, there's Major Abbott. All right, there we go. Jayhawking, another theme, jayhawking and religion for fun and profit. With one of them, really talking, these are different chapters in the book, because what we're really doing here. With one of John Brown's less bloodthirsty colleagues, though close colleague, a Methodist missionary turned fighting preacher, John Stewart. And you can see he's quite a tall man, because you can see his kind of legs. I don't know, you can see him down. You can almost see all of him behind there. Stewart, assigned to Kansas as a Methodist from New Hampshire, where he lived before, Stewart converted his trips on the preaching circuit into spy missions, then raiding parties, and that by the end he was doing things like running kangaroo courts. He and Major Abbott both ran what they call the squatters court down in southern Kansas to punish the wicked and reward the just, I guess you'd have to say. He funded his activities by liberating and selling the horses he ran across in the process of terrorizing pro-slavery settlers and occasionally freeing slaves. Sometimes got around to that. Probably quite a few more horses. The Stewart farm, and his picture is, obviously it's modern day, but this is the Blue Mound south of Lawrence. That was a landmark on the Santa Fe Trail, and Stewart's farm was down there, and it was not uncommonly cultivated by escaped slaves who were waiting for transport. John Brown, William Quantrill in disguise when Quantrill was in Lawrence pretending to be an abolitionist named Charlie Hart, and a bunch of other people from distinguished to extremely sketchy were hanging around at the Stewart farm by the Blue Mound. He's sort of my window into the criminal the way in which this is kind of connected. Both the good and bad of this is connected to the kind of criminal underworld around Lawrence. All right, that's Stewart. Another one, the big guy, genuinely radical activism for racial equality. That's a relative rarity among the Kansas Jayhawkers, as someone who actually cared about that and did something about it. Here the main example is Joseph Gardner, the big Quaker with a big knife, as I call him, because you can see down. I'm going to touch this again. You see this? That's what they call an Arkansas toothpick. Sometimes one version of a Bowie knife, but you see it's a short sword that you carry around, and that was one of the common weapons. But Joe seems to be very proud of his, or at least the photographer is proud of it, because he was clearly made to stand sideways so you could see his Arkansas toothpick. Nevertheless, this is actually one of the nicer guys on the whole thing. He's actually a very sincere and sympathetic man. He came to Kansas after being kicked out of his Indiana Quaker meeting. Among many other incidents surrounding Joe Gardner, he shot it out with slave catchers in his own home, and then became one of the white officers in the little-known actual first case of uniformed black troops fighting in the Civil War, which was not the 54th Massachusetts like you saw in the movie, or has the monument on Boston Common. Instead, it's the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, with one of the black non-commissioned officers pictured there, William Matthews. Like the 54th Massachusetts, they had white officers, and Joe Gardner was one of those. Fought in the Battle of Island Mound very early, and there's neither an island nor a mound there, but it's in western Missouri. It's a kind of a hillock with some trees around it. Joe Gardner led that battle, not very successfully, but he did lead that battle. Ended up grievously wounded for his trouble. This one of the most evocative things I've read in this is this terrible portrait of Joe Gardner lying face down unable to move as the prairie burns around him. And he actually survived that, though, lived the rest of his short life in blinding pain. But he was one of the ones who actually was after racial equality, Big Joe Gardner. Finally, another theme: the expropriation and genocide of the indigenous peoples of the plains. This is a forgotten aspect of Bleeding Kansas in general. Even the anti-slavery good guys out there were engaged in a colonial project that depended on taking Indian land in order to make it free, from slavery, but also from native ownership. One of the things that's the links that's not going to work is a map that the artist George Catlin did of what this area looked like in 1842 with the state of Missouri, and then 10 or 20 different Indian reservations. Some people like the Osage who'd lived in Kansas for generations, others people who'd just been sent there in Indian removal treaties. So anything all of Kansas was like entirely Indian territory until the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this started to be taken apart. So that's part of the whole thing. But this member of the Immortal Ten actually had a different role, different relationship to that theme. One of the Immortal Ten would give his life trying to restrain the worst excesses of U.S. colonialism on the plains. Young Silas Soule, and you can see what he looked like. The picture on the right is what he looked like at the time of the Doy rescue, and this is what he looked like after he'd seen some shit in Colorado, which he did. He's went to serve in the Army after Kansas in what was then extreme western Kansas, the part we now call Colorado, and it really was. What's Denver? Denver is nothing but a town named after the governor of Kansas. So there. It's just western Kansas that got cut off. Soule was present at the infamous Sand Creek Massacre of peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho villagers during the Civil War. True to his idealistic New England upbringing, this is a guy whose family entertainment growing up meant his dad reading aloud from the abolitionist newspapers. Soule tried to stop the massacre and later testified against its perpetrators. In fact, it's thanks to him largely that we even know much at all about the details of it. If he'd shut up, then we might not know that. For that bit of heroism, Silas was soon after that assassinated in the streets of Denver. So he's one of the heroes of the whole thing, and it'll take a long. I'm not going to go into all of that. In fact, I'm not going to go into any more of this Immortal 10 stuff. That's only 4 of the 10. So if you really want to be here for 2 hours, I could go through the other 6, but I just wanted to give you some tastes of the 4 of 10. I said, given all that, I'm not only really only going to be able to talk about a few aspects of the project today beyond that. And without making, I don't want to make my title a new misnomer about I said it was the ride of the Immortal Ten. I'm more going to focus for the rest of my time on the central guy, Dr. John Doy, on who he was and how he got into that predicament in Weston. Then I'll briefly cover at the end why his adventures were largely forgotten. Spoiler alert, the answer being they were forgotten on purpose and for cause. So we'll see why cause in court in the 19th century. We'll find out about that in a minute. The first thing to know, which you will not learn from reading Doy's own account. Oh yeah, okay. First thing you'll know, first thing to notice, is that his is a transatlantic story. There was way more of that going on around Bleeding Kansas than people realize today. The territory was positively swarming with British journalists, including John Brown's most active propagandist, James Redpath. There were many British settlers too. Brits remained, despite all the Germans and Irish streaming in from the 1840s on, the single largest group of migrants to 19th century North America, taken as a whole. The fighting preacher was a Brit too, the John Stewart. In general, British settlers didn't attract much adverse comment unless they were perceived as a group or prominent unpopular cause. But just in case you thought vicious accusations about immigrants were a new thing in American politics, there were rumors in Missouri of British paupers being scooped off the docks and sent to Kansas to vote against slavery. That actually people in Missouri who claimed to have witnessed troops of British paupers coming through the countryside. So that's one case where the British got some bad publicity. For the most part, they didn't. The vast majority of British immigrants came to farm or work rather than join political movements or get in trouble. John Doy sometimes seemed to be trying to make up for that. Others weren't trying to join political movements or get in trouble, though he kind of was. All right, switch gears for a moment and talk about this more in the way I do in the book manuscript. So, skip time. This time, the winter of 1858, 1859, as they're planning the thing that leads to the Doy capture and rescue. The winter of 1858-59 was a troubled one in Kansas Territory. The Bleeding Kansas' troubles had died down, but the economy had crawled to a halt. A drought was settling in, and the westward migrants whose spending everyone depended on were now headed to glitzier, more prosperous frontiers, the gold fields of Colorado or the logging boom in Minnesota. While the Free State forces had largely won their battle to keep slavery out of the territory several years earlier, their bid for statehood was trapped in a deadlock between Congress and the White House that would soon break up the Democratic Party and bring on the Civil War. What was worse, in the Kansas town of Lawrence, the Gibraltar of frontier anti-slavery, it's looking very Gibraltar-y in this. It's supposed to be, I'm not sure how realistic this picture is, but it's from a 19th century publication, so we'll just go with it. That's like the same hill that KU's on, right, Mount Oread, with a little fort on top of it. What was worse, in the Gibraltar of frontier anti-slavery, the Underground Railroad was now running in reverse. Black people who had come to Lawrence as a haven from slavery were being beset in the streets by white men looking to sell them in Missouri or return them to their putative owners there. Slave catchers actually made more money if they could enslave a free person rather than just collecting a reward. The crisis deepened after John Brown arrived in town with 13 enslaved people he'd liberated from Vernon County, Missouri, in one of the largest jayhawking raids to date. A slaveholder had been killed in the process, and a number of farms looted of their livestock and other goods. I think I have Vernon County way down here. So this is like, it says John Brown's raid, so it's kind of far away, but he'd brought the people that he'd liberated down there, had brought them all the way back up to Lawrence just before this, with half of Missouri pursuing it. Lawrence had repeatedly held off hordes of invading Missourians in the past, and now angry attention was trained on them from Missouri once again. Local leaders of the Underground Railroad felt the need to get as much of the small local black population as possible out of town and out of reach of Missouri slave catchers. Already the biggest celebrity among the Kansas Jayhawkers, John Brown organized his escape on his own, taking with him most of the people he had just liberated and many of the most competent abolitionists available as guards. That left a gap that the local organizers of the Underground Railroad filled with the enthusiastic and the available. One thing I feel like I've learned from this project is that history, especially in the early American frontier, often turns on ordinary people getting it over their heads and maybe not making the best decisions in some cases. So into this gap steps Dr. John Doy, a burly Englishman who was in fact not a doctor in any conventional sense, even though he always wrote his name, John Doy, MD, and he was definitely not an MD. He was a self-taught homeopath who could only practice sporadically. In 1858, Doy made most of his living selling seeds and writing articles on farming for Eastern newspapers, The Gentleman Farmer. Even though his own farm was at best a work in progress. And his farming articles, you can't tell if he's giving advice or is he asking, like, how do I farm? But they're very elaborate, so I don't know what's going on with that. His main qualifications as an emergency conductor on the Underground Railroad was that he owned a wagon for his passengers to ride in and was known to be up for just about anything, whether it was a good idea or not. Dr. Doy was especially game if the proposed activity might earn some money or could be thought of as promoting the cause of freedom and progress, preferably both. He liked to do both, preferably at the same time. Though he had a large and devoted family, Dr. Doy's CV up to this point would have to be described as sometimes well-intentioned, but definitely checkered. It turned out that he was well prepared for his time in the Missouri Gulag. In fact, it gets to the point where every time I find out some other jail he was in, I'm going like, oh, really, another one. He could jail well, as they say in certain areas of the culture. The details are a bit sketchy. Only Doy's enemies ever mentioned his pre-Kansas experiences, and he always, if you read his book, he always talks of himself as an American, even though he's an adopted American. Back in England, he was born in the East Anglian country town of Welburn, Norfolk. So, excuse me, there we go, John Doy's England. I'm sure this is like a little slice from the middle, right? This took me quite a ways to figure out how to do this. So Norfolk, down here in East Anglia, and he's from Welburn, where he's from, is just west of Norwich. And if this works correctly, you can see, wow, what a beautiful, this looks like quite a bucolic little town with apparently these round-towered Norman churches is just the thing, right? So I didn't get to go to, next time I go over there, I'll have to be visiting Welburn, but Welburn John Doy didn't seem to find it that bucolic because that was the first place that he got hauled in front of a court for robbery, but then acquitted as a young man. All right, let me get rid of Norfolk Welburn. The other aspect, the thing that's important about East Anglia is, of course, this is where the Puritans came from. It's where a lot of New England migrants came from. It's like an ultra-Protestant, anti-royalist place. It's exactly the kind of place you might expect someone with anti-authoritarian, ultra-Protestant ideas to come from. He next turns up in the drab inland seaport town of Hull, Kingston upon Hull, gateway to the Baltic, and home to one of his heroes, the anti-slavery campaigner William Wilberforce. And I'm sure you all know that Wilberforce is the man who's credited with stopping the slave trade in Britain and also for leading the campaign, which just ended when Wilberforce dies in 1833 of abolishing slavery in the British Empire. Though in the British Empire they abolished it peacefully by paying everyone. That is, paying the slave owners. But William Wilberforce, great hero, and he probably didn't really live in Hull all that much later in his life, but he was from Hull, and they have statues of him there. But there was little in the way of slavery to fight in Victorian Hull, and really not that much reform activity. Poverty, alcoholism, and poor sanitation were much bigger threats based on what I've read. Arriving from the East Anglian countryside looking for employment like many others, young John Doy married a Humberside girl, that's what they call it, Humberside. A Humberside girl named Jane Dunn, ran a restaurant, and then worked his way up as a foreman in a warehouse. Yet once again, he ended up before a court. This time his crime was stealing accordions and dolls from a hawker in the Hull marketplace. He and a rough-sounding friend named Enzoni were trying to collect an 11-pound debt and held the accordions hostage until someone, and met the guy at the Fleece Inn. I love that, the Fleece Inn. Luckily, Doy's boss at the warehouse vouched for his character, and once again, he was acquitted. I kind of feel like his wife is back there getting him off of these things sometimes. Doy bounced back briefly from the accordion theft incident by moving into more middle-class lines of work. He got into the seed business, a big deal in Hull, where there was a boom just then in the manufacture of linseed oil paint and similar substances derived from crushing seeds. He also tried his hand at stockbrokering, chiefly dealing in shares of local public works companies like docks and railroads, and helped start the Hull New Stock Exchange in 1845. Or at least he took out an ad. He took out an ad in the newspaper that said that. I haven't found any evidence of an actual Hull New Stock Exchange, but he definitely took out an ad for it. But he liked to do that, have ads in newspapers. For a time, he sold both seeds and stocks out of a commodious-sounding house on Porter Street, complete with conveniences, outbuildings, and a garden. It sounded like a palace for Hull, and he must have had money from somewhere, because Hull was a place where working people tended to live near muck gars, where the night soilmen dumped the sewage every night manually, where they looked at Liverpool as a healthy place. Liverpool and Manchester were considered healthy places. If only it could be as nice as Liverpool and Manchester, the reformers said in Hull. Yet the halcyon days of John Doy, the stockbroker of Hull, were short-lived. By the middle of 1846, the house on Porter Street was being sold at auction, and Doy was looking to take advantage of another big business in Hull, the shipping of emigrants to America. More successful Hull businessmen made money shipping others, but Doy was looking to ship himself and family, exporting their little bit of the surplus population, possibly before the workhouses could get them. Dickensian, right? Get it? You saw what I did there, right? While the fact was not very well known outside of Hull, is not very well known outside of Hull, an estimated 2.2 million souls passed through the ports of the River Humber on their way to the United States and Canada from the 1830s to the turn of the century. The bulk of these migrants were Germans, Russians, and Scandinavians who arrived via Hull's Baltic fleet and then transferred to transatlantic voyages via rail through Liverpool or directly out of Hull. For Hull, they went to less popular destinations, didn't go to New York, they went to Boston and Quebec. I've not been able to locate the Doy family's exact means of egress, but it seems likely that they left on one of the many ships that sailed from Hull to Quebec in the late 1840s and settled somewhere in Canada, possibly Brockville, just up the river from Montreal. Dr. Doy kept extra quiet about his family's Canadian sojourn. It seems likely he ended up in legal trouble there too. After he became famous in Kansas, an article circulated widely out of Rochester, New York, claiming that Doy had done time in Coburg Jail, Canada West, and came across Lake Erie in a hurry to Rochester, New York when he got out. At any rate, Rochester is the next place he ends up and the place that gets him to Kansas. Rochester was a rapidly growing boom town in those days. Doy inserted himself into the edges of its business community, much like he had in Hull, while displaying a new interest in morally improving reform causes that famously captured the middle-class imagination there. And this is a book about Rochester that just about everybody who went to grad school or college probably between the mid-'80s and the 2010s had to read about reform enthusiasm in Rochester. It was also Frederick Douglass's home and one of the centers of the global abolition movement, among many other movements, actually. One can imagine that hailing from Wilberforce's hometown was a good backstory to have. Doi opened an intelligence office that matched immigrants with domestic service jobs around town and also operated as a travel agency, selling steamer tickets to and from Europe. An eager autodidact as well as a promiscuous entrepreneur, Doi had also been reading up on alternative medicine, specifically homeopathy. Also known as hydropathy, this was the art of treating illness with very little intervention and infinitesimal doses of medicine. I mean, which is not a terrible idea when you lack antibiotics and most of your treatments don't work, and the main drugs were mercury and opium. You know, you can see like using little bits was probably not a terrible idea. It was also a type of medicine with very low overhead. So he hung out a shingle in Rochester advertising the water cure, and it's at that point that he gradually starts styling himself as Dr. John Doi. His future course, though, was probably determined by too many mingled with at meetings of the local temperance league. The Reverend Frederick Starr, recently exiled from Missouri for teaching enslaved people to read, and insurance salesman Daniel R. Anthony, whose whole Quaker family was deeply enmeshed in reform causes, including temperance, anti-slavery, and feminism. Does anyone know who Dan Anthony's sister would be? I guess Susan B. Anthony, right. Susan B. Anthony's brother. John Doi involved himself in temperance and anti-slavery politics a bit in advance. You know, it's just like him. He got himself involved in politics a bit in advance of strictly acquiring the citizenship rights to do so. As usual, he spent some jail time there, this time for illegal voting. Somewhat incongruously, very incongruously, he also found employment through his reform acquaintances as a moral policeman, as he called it, for the Rochester Juvenile Reform Society. For a time, he was picking up, and you read that, you can see that's a very long thing giving some of his monthly arrest stats. For a time, he was picking up 60 or more truant and vagrant children a month. Doi formulated and published a whole philosophy to explain his approach to sweeping up Rochester's delinquents. Kindness versus brutality, he said, and he was on the kindness side. Many working class children and their parents did not see it that way. They found Doi's methods to be more brutal than kind, and there were complaints. In fact, the moral policing gig had probably about run its course when Doi identified a new community to help out in Kansas Territory. So it was now early summer 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act has just been passed, promising that the question of slavery in the territories would be decided by democracy, by actual settlers. Over in Boston, the New England Emigrant Aid Co. had just announced its ambitious plan to recruit northern colonists to settle Kansas Territory en masse before Missourians could extend their slave society one door west. This was catnip for a man like John Doi, and he immediately traveled to Boston and picked up all the brochures. Initially more of a travel agency than the social movement or a land company, the Immigrant Aid Company booked subsidized travel for groups of colonists and promised them accommodation in Kansas and the chance to buy cheap land. Doi and Dan Anthony secured passage on the very first train of Immigrant Aid Company colonists, which stopped in Rochester to pick them up and then connected with them with a steamer they were excited to find was called the Plymouth Rock. That they sang songs about that, how the new Plymouth Rock they were founding. The Pioneer Party arrived at Mount Oread to find actually that almost nothing was ready for them, except a handful of competing squatters who had gotten there first and had to be warned off. Doi built a cabin. Let me do the rest of the media, the Immigrant Aid Company media blitz. That's the song I make my students sing in class. It's to the tune of all. We won't have to do that because we need to move on. But it says it all. And they really did make them sing it before they got on the trains. Where was I? So he's building a cabin and looked forward to selling his lots in the new town that they were creating. Yet his expectations of being a real estate magnate were dashed when the second load of colonists arrived, a much larger group including company officials Charles Robinson and Samuel Pomeroy, a future Kansas governor and senator. They voided all of the Pioneer Party's arrangements, named the town Lawrence after their chief financial backer, and exiled Doi to the edges of town. Most of the Pioneer Party went back home or elsewhere. a sharp businessman, Dan Anthony slid off to the more established town of Leavenworth and became one of the Free State ringleaders there. Relegated to the western outskirts of town, Doy scrambled to establish a farm he had no clue how to operate and sent for his family, wife Jane, 3 daughters and 6 sons, including the eldest, 21-year-old Charles, who's in the picture, who would be his father's unfortunate cohort in most of the enterprises to follow. Of course, holding on to a farm was not an easy thing in Kansas because you had to establish a claim, you had to build some sort of dwelling, and then you had to protect it from competitors and passers-by who might want to burn your cabin or steal the wood and build their own. Missourians also began coming in force to vote in Kansas elections. Doy missed the first Kansas election because he was too busy shooting a man named Lowry, who kept trying to invade his farm. You know, instead of going to vote, he waited and caught Lowry and blasted him through the leg. Again, Doy got to visit the local jail. That was the beginning of 2 years of armed electioneering and sporadic fighting that became world famous as Bleeding Kansas, and I won't bother you with all this, but Doys were foot soldiers in all of it, carrying their Sharps rifles in any place that anything that happened around that county, and many things happened, those guys were there. Back to 1859. In 1859, it was theoretically this military experience that prepared John and Charles Doy for their. There we go. That's I should have put that up. That's kind of what it would have looked like in Lawrence when they got there. So like tents and some houses in the distance. It was theoretically this military experience that prepared John and Charles Doy for the Underground Railroad mission, they were tasked. Yet he may have neglected his studies in military tactics, what with all the farming and alternative medicine and seed selling. Dr. Doy scouted the route north because the idea was they were going to take them on what they called the Lane Trail. That was a way that you went north or east by not going through Missouri. Right? The Lane Trail means going through Nebraska and Iowa and avoiding Missouri at all costs. So you can, if you have relatives who want to avoid you, you can euphemistically refer to them as using the Lane Trail. Or tell them to use the Lane Trail. I don't know. He scouted the route north and pressed a gullible local minister's son named Wilbur Clough into driving a second rented wagon. That created enough space to carry all the 13 passengers that had been assembled for him. 7 adult men, 4 women, and 2 children. That's a list that was published in the Missouri newspapers for the convenience of people who thought their slaveholders who thought their enslaved workers had escaped. At least two were freemen, definitely freemen of northern birth, Charles Smith and Wilson Hayes, who worked as cooks in the Eldridge House Hotel. So he got enough wagons, but he failed to recruit any scouts or guards to ride ahead of the wagons on the day. He blamed John Brown for taking all the usual suspects with him, but the situation was not ideal when they set off, because Lawrence was also full of spies and traitors, including a seemingly friendly restaurant owner named Hiram Whitley, who helped Doy plan the escape. Whitley, if you can believe this guy is the future head of the U.S. Secret Service, like one of the founders of the U.S. Secret Service, a hero of the Lincoln administration, but he was just like a scumbag out in Kansas, basically. Whitley helped him plan the escape and then immediately passed the word to the very slave catchers who'd been causing all the trouble. The Hurd brothers and the McGees, Jake, Tom, and their cousin, Cuckold Tom. Jake, Tom, and Cuckold Tom. That's what it says. I don't make it up. The Hurd and McGee lair was on the Delaware Indian Reserve just north of the Kansas River. Probably you can see where this is going. On the morning of the escape, January 25th, 1859, the little convoy had traveled about 12 miles north of Lawrence, deep into the rolling hills of the Delaware Reserve along Buck Creek, when they found their road blocked by some 20 men on horseback. They included Hiram Whitley and the postmaster of Lawrence, a Democrat, the Hurds and the McGees, plus a group of well-dressed men that no one recognized. They turned out to be Missourians, of course, led by a man who identified himself eventually as the mayor of Weston. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Doys and their passengers had little choice but to get kidnapped. The doctor did ask loudly to see the kidnapper's warrant and berated Whitley and the postmaster as traitors to make himself feel better, but didn't really do much. They were forced marched some 40 miles east to the Rialto Ferry across from Weston and found a howling mob waiting for them on the Missouri shore, where a good chunk of Weston's population had been up all night waiting to get a look at some real live abolitionists. And I think it's fair to say it in that voice. They survived that first night, but the ordeal was just the beginning. They were cycled through several different prisons, each worse than the last, landing eventually in what Doy called an iron box with no lights in the county seat of Platte City. Visitors had to hold up candles to get a look at them, and Doy finally made himself a candle by saving little scraps of fat from their food and making himself a little homemade candle so he could actually see. The passengers were either returned to the owners who claimed them or turned over to slave traders. Charles Smith, one of the cooks, and Bill Riley, one of the guys slave catchers that tried to get in Lawrence, escaped eventually, but Wilson Hayes, the other cook, was taken to Independence and enslaved for $1,000, pure profit for the Hurd brothers. The Missouri authorities decided they needed to put someone from Kansas on trial for helping enslaved people. They would have preferred a real ringleader like John Brown or Preacher Stewart, but this loud British man would have to do. One of the passengers was an enslaved fiddler named Dick, who had lived in Weston and went to Kansas with a pass to play some gigs for money, because slavery's a weird institution. There are plenty of enslaved people who essentially didn't live with their owners. They just went out and did work, including being an itinerant musician. And as long as they gave some money to came back and gave money to the person that claimed them, they were in trouble. They were fine. Dick apparently had gone to play some gigs in Kansas with permission, but never came back. The story was concocted that Doy had come to Missouri and enticed Dick to escape. Despite a total lack of evidence that Doy had ever been to Weston or had any connection with Dick before he got in that wagon to get the convoy out of Lawrence. All right. There we go. St. Joseph. That's what St. Joe as of 1852. And the place that's the courthouse up on the hill. The jail, the relatively nice jail where he was held, would essentially been behind there, behind the courthouse on the top of the hill. When the trial convened in St. Joseph after a change of venue, it was the biggest thing the town had ever seen. The Kansas Territorial Legislature appropriated funds to pay for Dr. Doy's defense, and his wife Jane rushed to Lawrence with the best lawyer in Kansas, former Territorial Governor Andrew Reeder, to defend him. The equally high-powered prosecution counsel had little but politics to go on. Someone needed to be punished for threatening slavery in Missouri, and if Dr. Doy had not enticed Dick, he must have done something else equally bad. People like him were a threat to the fabric of Missouri society. They argued. The defense pled that Doy's family was suffering from his incarceration. This is the prosecutor's response. "What, may not our families suffer?" replied one prosecutor in a widely lampooned speech. "If we allow our Negroes to be stolen with impunity, our fair-skinned daughters will be reduced to performing the contemptible drudgery of the kitchen." As if more than a small fraction of white women in Missouri or Kansas were avoiding that particular drudgery, since the vast majority of whites in Missouri did not own slaves, by the way. Maybe the Missouri authorities just did not appreciate Dr. Doy's assertive wife Jane and daughter Pamelia, who were definitely in the faces of everyone in St. Joe as much as they could be. Despite everything, the Doy's first trial was almost fair. Pro-slavery moderates in Missouri were eager to show that slavery could operate according to some semblance of the rule of law. Charles Doy's case was dismissed and John's ended in a hung jury. The doctor stayed in jail nonetheless, sending out various open letters and documenting the interactions of slavery with the criminal justice system in Missouri. What he found was that the county jails doubled as punishment centers for area slaveholders and warehouses for traveling slave traders, who were doing a huge business just then as worried slaveholders rushed to cash out their workers before they could escape to Kansas or be emancipated. When Dr. Doy's case was retried in July, 6 months after the kidnapping, Missouri left nothing to chance. Area Congressman James Craig joined the prosecution team and personally lobbied every single juror to make sure that Dr. Doy was convicted on the one count of slave stealing regarding Dick the Fiddler. After that conviction, the state planned to try Doy again and get an additional sentence for each of the other 12 passengers, ensuring that Doy would spend the rest of his life at hard labor in Jet City. Lawrence, they decided it could not let that pass. They didn't actually even like Dr. Doy that much back there, but the insult was too much. The injustice was too much. Some favored an all-out assault on St. Joseph with Sharp's rifles blazing. Major Abbott, the arms smuggler, however, suggested a stealth mission instead. He recruited the Immortal Ten over the course of one day and had everyone ready to travel on the second day. While an armed invasion would have been much better for me, that would have been much more cinematic for historians to write about. Instead, Abbott decided to attack the problem with improv rather than guns. I didn't say that right. They were going to use improv rather than guns. They would ride to St. Joe in wagons, telling everyone they were disappointed gold seekers returning from Colorado. Once in town, they cased out the streets in the jail, using the offices of the local Free Soil newspaper as their headquarters. Out on the town, they played various roles, such as farmer in town to buy supplies, businessmen checking out real estate, especially the fact that Preacher Stewart played the swell businessman and actually bought real estate while he was out casing things. It's like, okay. After giving Dr. Doy the high sign from outside the jail early in the day, they waited until late in the evening to make their move. With a thunderstorm raging, they play-acted their way into the jail. They posed as, there's the jail. Sorry, I forgot to do the jail. There's the jail he's in, brand new 2-story jail. One of his windows was in the upper story. And then here's a French interpretation of the rescue from some kind of French magazine that I will explain what's supposed to be going on in here. They pose as a posse bringing in a criminal. Joe Gardner and the Doy's nosy neighbor Stephen Willis would hold weapons on the other big man of the group. The guy in the middle, I'll just have to go back to the picture. You'll see him, a rough-hewn Irishman named Tom Simmons. Tom Simmons would take the role of the captured horse thief. Tom Simmons must have been the one who could spit out profanity the best, because he was supposed to be the play of drunk Irishman and angry, sane racist. They allayed any suspicions the jailer might have about marauding abolitionists by intentionally talking racist. Simmons loudly refused to be put in a cell, and I'm changing the language. Simmons loudly refused to be put in a cell with black prisoners, prompting the jailer to assure him there was a separate area for whites on the upper floor, thus revealing Dr. Doy's location. Once they were in the doctor's presence, the rescuers pounced, and that's what I think the French artist is trying to show here. "This is but a ruse!" cried Gardner, his big knife suddenly clattering to the ground. That's when the jailer knew something was wrong, when the giant knife fell on the ground. Startled, Willis turned his 10-inch revolver on the jailer. Tom Simmons undid his own hands, and suddenly he had a weapon too. The cords on his wrist were a slingshot. In fact, he's just undid his hands and has his hidden slingshot. Dr. Doy had promised the other prisoners they were escaping too, but Major Abbott forced them all back with guns. Kansas was here to defend the rule of law, not at least the ones they liked, not to spread anarchy. So no other prisoners got to go, including black, they were enslaved people they could have freed down below, but they didn't do that either. He convinced the jailer that a horde of Kansas assassins would shoot him to dead if he tried to warn anyone, and they all hurried off into the night, mixing in with the crowds as the bars and theaters closed. They were back across the river in boats. They went back across the river in boats they had hidden and got back to Lawrence for a celebration and a photo shoot, as we've seen the next day. Okay, that brings me about the halfway mark of my book, so we've only got another hour. 60% tops. Just kidding, I'm almost done. But this is kind of like the middle of the book, probably. Because I do plan to follow everyone's tragic fates in the book. Mostly this project is about telling the story, but getting everyone's trajectories right is what I hope will give it some additional historiographic value. Historians have always been aware of how many of the different 19th century reform movements intersect with each other, but maybe not to this extent and this far down in society. We know about Horace Greeley and Susan B. Anthony at the top of the chain, but much less about the people besides John Brown that their movements connected them to. The Doys in particular connected the best and the worst that 19th century reform had to offer. And I'll just briefly trace the rest of his meteoric rise and fall from abolitionist celebrity to intentionally forgotten man. So, Doy was working on the book about his experiences even while he was still in jail. Working title, 6 Months in the Dungeons of Missouri. By the time of they didn't just be calling the Kansas narrative, they didn't like his dungeons, remarkably. By the time the election year of 1860 rolls around, he was done and out on a tour of the East to promote the book and campaign for Abe Lincoln. And this is probably the highlight of Dr. Doy's life, really hobnobbing with all kinds of celebrities and speaking to huge audiences in Boston, Buffalo, New York, and all kinds of other places. Shared the stage with stars of the abolitionist movement, including the great Boston orator Wendell Phillips. But that wasn't everything that was going on with the Doy family. Meanwhile, his son Charles was back in Kansas, spiraling. Economic depression was still the order of the day there. While friends joined the army or opened stores or dug for gold, the effectively homeless Charlie stayed out riding the plains, trying to make a living with his sharp rifle. Dr. Doy had to cut his book tour short and probably was never spoken to again by a lot of these very respectable people he was dealing with when the news arrived via the press that Charlie had been murdered out in Kansas, riddled with bullets by a posse after barricading himself in a cabin with some other people that were said to be horse thieves. The Eastern abolitionist press tried to make this out as a political lynching, revenge for Charlie's fight against slavery. The Kansas press across the spectrum called him a horse thief who had finally been brought to justice. And I don't know which is true. It's probably somewhere in between. I would say it's 2/3 horse thief, 1/3 revenge, probably. Definitely a lynching, though, but one that was tolerated. Never that respected in Kansas to begin with, the rest of the Doy family left after that in semi-disgrace. A couple of Charlie's brothers joined the Union Army. John and Jane and the rest of the children resettled in Battle Creek, Michigan, a haven for radical activists and alternative believers of all kinds. There, Dr. Doy took up his homeopathic medical practice full-time and pursued both old and new interests. The Doys had long been committed feminists. There's Battle Creek. The Doys had long been committed feminists in many different ways, so he now specialized partly in what we would call gynecology. Religiously, they got more creative in Battle Creek, trading in their ancestral Methodism for spiritualism. And that doesn't mean singing spirituals, that means communicating with spirits, for those of you who aren't 19th century historians. Perhaps Charlie's death had something to do with that. At the same time, Dr. Doy made himself out into a great advocate of science and progress, as you can see. That's one of his ads for his medical practice. Man and science must progress. Bleeding and blistering pass by. But that's kind of the pitch of homeopathy is like, we won't bleed you. We won't bleed you. We won't blister you. We'll just give you some drugs. In small amounts. Looking at his ads in Battle Creek newspapers, however, we can tell how Dr. Doy made his medical practice more of a financial success in this period. He and the dentist he shared offices with there kept up a lively business selling drugs, including through the mail, medicines through the mail. There's no illegal, very few. They're just now thinking about making these drugs illegal, in fact. Partly because of guys like this, but that's her. Euphemistic medical ads and drug sales aimed at women in 19th century newspapers also usually meant birth control and abortion services were being provided. And in fact, I think it's probably sort of likely that he'd been doing that for a while, probably even back in Lawrence too. But that's kind of what he focused on once he got to Battle Creek. This was a particularly important and dangerous time to be taking up this work in Civil War era America. Birth control and abortion had never been very respectable practices in America, but before the mid-19th century, they were generally not illegal. That changed as mainstream medicine professionalized itself and went after competitors like midwives and homeopaths. At the same time, so-called moral reformers were outlawing everything they saw as aberrant sexual practices, notably prostitution and pornography. Abortion was officially announced as a dangerous and generally immoral practice by the medical profession that government needed to strictly regulate or prohibit. Several waves of anti-abortion laws were passed across the country, with Michigan an early adopter. Abortion was limited to therapeutic uses only, with 2/3 certified physicians required to sign off. In 1869, the state had just passed a second set of laws presaging the Federal Comstock Act that allowed the sale and advertising even of recipes or prescriptions for preventing birth or inducing miscarriages, and they probably had Doy's ads out on the floor of the legislature where they debated that. Just a few weeks after that bill passed, as you might expect by now, Dr. John Doy was arrested and put on trial for violating these various laws. But a pretty serious case of what the newspapers called antenatal child murder. Much of the court testimony was it's one of these things, and I don't really I have for people's advice about what to do with this, because you could certainly make him out to be a feminist hero, the hero, person who's trying to provide these services in a hostile world, and he clearly was a committed feminist, and you could do that story, but much of the court testimony is not so flattering. It seems that Doy was now working with medical instruments rather than just chemicals in the water cure. He'd aborted the 5-month-old fetus, meaning the fetus of 5 months, of a woman named Carolyn Graves, indiscreetly enough that several of her neighbors saw the perfectly healthy, but of course dead, corpse, as this from the press. To compound that very bad look, it was clearly no charitable act. Graves and her husband testified that Doy had forced them to mortgage their farm to come up with his $100 asking price. Doy claimed the fetus was already dead when he got there and that he'd removed it merely to save Carolyn Graves. Could be true. That wasn't what the neighbor ladies thought they saw. The court did not agree. Doy was convicted and could look forward to a long jail sentence, and this time there'd be no helpful Kansans to break him out. Yet he still had supporters in Battle Creek. The feminists and spiritualists and other outliers there were now thoroughly at odds with the moral branch of social reform. Someone snuck some morphine into Dr. Doy's cell, and he was found dead the next morning, a few days after his conviction, in apparent suicide. A large crowd, here we go, this is the last thing. A large crowd attended an apparently lively spiritualist funeral for him a few days later. In a Where Are They Now vein, newspapers across the nation linked the scandalous Michigan abortion case to the sensational 1859 escape story. Yeah, last page. I warned you. Commentators either wondered where Dr. Doy went wrong or argued that his morals had always been bad and they'd always known it. To the Southern and the Democratic press, it demonstrated the immoral and criminal streak they had long detected in Northern social reformers and in all Republicans and anti-slavery activists. Back in Kansas, the Leavenworth Times, which was controlled by Doy's old Rochester friend Dan Anthony, commented that the story was, quote, good enough for a whole Democratic political campaign, back when the Democrats were a different thing than they are now. That never happened, even though further scandal occasionally trickled out. One of John Doy's sons, Dr. Wilberforce C. Doy, took up his father's mantle as Battle Creek's alternative gynecologist and had to flee to the East Coast after one of his patients died following an abortion procedure. Meanwhile, Kansas got busy memorializing almost every aspect of the great and successful Free State Crusade, especially anything connected to John Brown. Publishers did keep reusing that great photo of the Immortal Ten, often without making it clear what it was. After a while, it was often thought to be a band of border ruffians rather than their arch enemies. In fact, I have a couple books that have that picture on the cover as border ruffians. It's like, oh, they would be so upset if they knew that. They got in those cool outfits, and then somebody thinks they're Missourians. Dr. Doy generally became a minor character in his own story. And in fact, Major Abbott and other surviving members of the Immortal Ten kind of saw to that when they wrote about the incident. Funnily enough, one of the main ways that Doyle lived on was the persistent rumor, repeatedly published in the press, that he had actually not died in that Michigan cell. The story was that he had just drugged himself into a coma, Romeo and Juliet style, and then secretly went back home to England. The British newspapers were happy to carry that story, as many did, yet no one ever claimed to see John Doyle again. And a man who was so devoted to attracting publicity and getting into trouble seems unlikely to have kept quiet for very long, unless he really was in the grave, which, at least according to his family and Find a Grave, he is. So anyway, sorry to keep you so long, but that's what I've got for the Ride of the Immortal Ten. And as you can tell, it goes on to many other places, but I will just leave it alone for now, and happy to take questions or rejoinders or anyone that wants to tell me what it all means. Thank you.
Exactly what we were anticipating. If you have a question, you have to say it to me, and then I have to restate it for the people online. If you need to slip out discreetly, now is the time. We take 3 or 4 questions here, and we always start first with students. And we have many British students who might disagree with that description of Hull.
Yeah, they pretty much always hate. It's always the bits. In fact, I've learned that if I say Hull, in fact, when I went to Hull that last summer, it's like it was so embarrassing to say that to a British person. You say, "Where are you going to go? Are you going to go to London?" And I say, "Yeah," and then I'm going to go to Hull.
Who would like to ask the first question? Anyone like to ask? Jeff? Oh, there we go. Kevin's got one.
Yeah, somebody back there.
Larry first, I guess.
Okay, you mentioned throughout the piece, which was brilliant, and I loved that the storytelling was fun. I feel like today in our world, people say it takes all kinds, to get a movement going and to win, political victories, etc. Like, what should we make of this gentleman, this story? Like, does it take all kinds? Like, what is his relationship to the reform movements of the 19th century? This kind of craving for publicity and being at the center stage, is that something that you think is just like naturally kind of part of any kind of public movement?
For our viewers online, the question is, John Doyle just doesn't fit. What do you make of him?
Well, I would say, I guess I think what Larry was trying to say was, I think I do agree with, is that the alternative beliefs and radical beliefs take alternative and radical people. And they may, in fact, take people with who don't have the good judgment to just go along with what society tells them, right? And that may lead to bad judgment in other areas, in some cases. That seems to be in his case. He did have the right beliefs, so he could see there are things wrong with society. He wanted to do with them, and he just didn't necessarily make very good decisions about how to do it. And his lack of and I feel like this is hardly. I mean, if you start delving into some of the ordinary people, I mean, frankly, this is John Brown as well, right? It's like, I mean, John Brown did it in ways that are slightly more admirable. He actually did steal some. He actually liberated quite a few horses himself and things like that too. That you do need people who are just don't know enough to go along with what society tells them, and he definitely didn't. As far as what it all means, I guess to me, I mean, if I was going to, I should have made myself do this for this talk, but I was too busy trying to pull it all together in some way. But I guess what I would say is that when you talk about movements, you do need to talk about these kind of people. And I'm not saying that like John Doyle represents these movements better than Wendell Phillips does, but maybe equally as well. That maybe he fits better than it seems like at first, and that we should think of it from that perspective as well as the perspective of the people who had the deep thoughts.
Yeah, I have the benefit of showing up a little late, so I know I can speak into the
Okay.
Kind of building off, thank you for partially stealing my question, how dare you. When we think of especially the war, the border war and stuff like that out of Missouri, Mark Feldman talks about essentially these men who become unmoored from society and social constraints.
Yeah.
Those when we remember, right? Yeah. So, the Jesse James and all that stuff. So sort of flipping his question on its head a little bit, when you look at these Immortal Ten, they seem sort of not men who became unmoored in society because they found themselves in Kansas, but they were unmoored from society and then went to Kansas. So when you think of them sort of in context with the reform movements that they're part of, do you see them as, I don't want to say idealist, right? Like, David Potter describes John Brown as just a not well-adjusted man, which is...
Yeah, no, I think there's something to that probably, right?
Right. But when you're looking at this group of guys who are willing to go do this, especially after most of the border fighting has died down and Lecompton is being debated and all that stuff.
Yeah, I guess that I should emphasize a bit more that this is like way after
Yeah.
a lot of stuff. Though there are a lot of things going on in the book. There's a ton about stuff that was going on between Bleeding Kansas and this. Like there's a whole southern, like the Browns raid in Vernon County was part of a, basically things were kind of done, getting kind of boring up by Lawrence. So it's like, why not let's take it to Fort Scott.
Yeah.
Let's go down to the south and see what we can stir up there.
Yeah,
So that.
Partially, yeah. So like when you look at these guys, you see them as, men looking for a reform movement to tag on to, or people who simply are a little out of touch with the social norms around them, who are looking for an outlet and find themselves in Kansas in this place where sort of violence and idealism combine a little bit.
Well, that sounds right. I mean, what's the or there, Kevin? Was there an or?
Or are they, I guess, people who truly believe in their cause and fit into a broader idea of how we think about reform movements from 1830 to 1860?
Well, they certainly do fit into some of the profiles in other ways. But I guess I'm just impressed with Kansas about that there is a lot of maladjustment and there is a lot of people who kind of found themselves in that chaos, and maybe the self they found wasn't so great. And that's actually even what some of the later commentators about the boys would say about things like the frontier. There's like a Lawrence newspaper columnist who kind of says Bleeding Kansas ruined them, basically.
It's really interesting.
So you say he's obviously very revolutionary, with especially the stuff he does later in his life with feminism and abortion. And knowing a little bit more about Norfolk and Hull, they're not the most revolutionary place, I would say.
No, they're not at all.
My question would be, where do you think he kind of got this streak of revolutionary spirit? And his family as well seem very revolutionary.
Yeah, no, I didn't even really convey to the extent that they supported him, all the way, even through all those trips to jail and all the weird things and accusations. The children all wanted to be just like him, as far as I can see. And his wife supports him. Goes out of her way to support him, support all the stuff that he does. Where he came from, I don't know. I think he's a little bit of a chameleon early on. I actually feel like he must have Hull is kind of boring and drab and very backward even then. Yeah, I think more backward if you read about Hull of the 19th century. It really was like, can we catch up to Liverpool someday? It's like I don't know, he read about Wilberforce, and I think he may have gotten the idea at some point. And he's the kind of guy I kind of feel like there's probably at some point where it was something he said, and then it kind of became real. I guess I don't know. He doesn't have, other than that book, there isn't like a lot of letters for him. I kind of picture him like he started thinking about this a little bit when he was in Hull. Then he gets to Rochester. And it's like, oh, I'm from Hull. Do you know Wilberforce was in there? And he kind of made some progress with people talking about that. And Rochester was full of radical stuff. So that's probably the point. And that's the point where you can definitely show him doing radical stuff rather than just trying to be a stockbroker or sell steeds or all the other things that he did. So that's probably the place, I would guess.
Thanks, Jeff. I really am excited for your work. I'm struck by Joy's kind of
working class life, and it seems to me like a lot of people in the 19th century would live this way if they weren't able to succeed as a farmer. And I'm wondering if you see yourself kind of connecting a lot of political economy in this book, or if you're going to focus more on the story. And then I have a second or side question, because of me. I noticed he ends up Battle Creek, Michigan. Does he by chance engage in vegetarianism?
I don't know that that shock me. He seems like the kind of person who, he's kind of open to picking up just about anything. So in some ways, I would be very shocked if he wasn't a vegetarian, if he didn't have at least one dietary quirk. You know what I mean? And if he didn't have one, he was probably looking for one. But so I don't. The question about political economy, I definitely do try to connect it when I can. I mean, the thing is, this is the thing I think it's like kind of a theme throughout my work. Depending on whatever I'm working on, I'm always dealing with these people who are kind of like trying to define themselves and kind of always in danger of falling out of it. Always in danger. They kind of want to be middle class, but they're always in danger of. They're always this far from prison or falling out of it. And I guess I think that probably is a bit more of a mass experience in the 19th century, maybe, than it is now. It certainly is something that happens to people involved in movements. I mean, I guess that's to go back to the original question. But I don't want to say I wouldn't want to be the guy who says well, you have to be kind of maladjusted and rootless and maladjusted to be involved in a movement, because that's not altogether true. And he was, he had a family and stuff like that, and it's not like that. But there is a sort of openness to anything, openness to anything, because you're not really settled. You're always looking for a new thing, and sometimes the new thing are these movements, or being the guy who'll say, yeah, I'll go grab delinquents in the streets of Rochester, or sure, I'll go risk to take people on the Underground Railroad. Why not?
Sarah.
Hi, I'm in the back here, so
Hi.
I'm gonna try to. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. This is just kind of like a philosophical question, and wondering rhetorically, if you kind of piggybacking off of what Maeve said too. Do you think if he was born and raised in Missouri, he would have been the man that he was and as revolutionary as he was?
No. No way. No, not at all. I mean, I think that all of these people are from, there are a few Missouri outliers, absolutely. I mean, one of the things in his, I didn't really, I felt like I went into enough, but in St. Joe, one of the reasons he gets a fair trial, and one of the ways reason he's able to escape, is because he actually has sympathizers in St. Joe. There's a Free Soil newspaper there called the Free Democrat that kind of basically give them the office and helps them out. So it's not as monolithic as it sometimes can seem, but no, it's not a place where alternative beliefs and seekers and such would have been welcome. So, yeah, it's and I think in that sense the transatlantic aspect. There's probably is a reason why all these British people were out in Kansas, because that was that was clearly a place where something was happening, and they were people who were looking for a place that it's just like it was a hot spot that a lot of these people went to. So I'm not sure if that's what are you asking about Missouri?
Yeah, you answered my question. I was just wondering how kind of environment shapes the way that a person thought back then.
Well, Kansas was an environment, and it's even hard to convey just how chaotic it was. It's literally like a place where if you're away from your house for more than 3 hours, somebody might have burned it down or stolen. Or the thing they particularly did that always struck me is they steal the wood for it. Not burn it, just steal all the wood and build some other cabin down the road with it. It's harsh, right? So you can see how the twitchy they'd get, and how chaos would do things to you.
Okay, I'm going to ask Jeff the last question, and then I hope everyone can join us for our Pursuit of Happiness hour out in the foyer. Jeff, so how does this change how, how does this change how we view bleeding Kansas? Because you would normally tell this story, wouldn't you, about the elections, or you would talk about the political violence, you talk about Sackville Lawrence and John Brown. You're entering this in both chronologically later, but through a different cast of characters. What's the sort of revision to the textbook story of bleeding Kansas?
I guess the main one is it doesn't, the 1855-56 stuff is actually just one phase of it. In that you really should treat the whole thing from the Kansas-Nebraska Act to sometime after Quantrill's raid in 1863 as one big thing, because it's kind of always morphing and moving different places. I mean, I still use the chronology, but you almost ought not to, because a lot of these people, like especially the ones who were really into it, like Preacher Stewart, it's like he's just like, okay, well, I've been home for a week, where can I go now, right? And it's like down to Fort Scott, or it's over in Missouri. It's just kind of wherever they can, and so it also does mean that the trouble during the Civil War, the fact that it basically never stopped. It's like they did not expect it to be troublesome there, but I think they realized that it was. I don't think historians realize the degree to which it was kind of just an ongoing thing. And I also think you get a different, it's definitely a darker view of the whole thing if you look at it from the point of view of these ordinary people, because they're not, some of the Immortal Ten are the, Major Abbott is a leading citizen and actually is heavily involved in defrauding the Shawnees and other things later. So some of them are kind of establishment figures, others are not at all, and it just gets a different, it's a different view of it. It's not, I'm not out to kind of make them, I'm not out to make them to do the thing where you say, well, it's all about land or it's not about slavery, In fact, I think the place I get is that they really do believe in all this stuff, but they were just, things got so chaotic and they became these just lifelong feuds with each other, and just life and chaos that kind of has its own logic that gets way away from anything to do directly with slavery, and I'm also amazed by how even though the story of the leaders of it, like Dr. Charles Robinson, the governor, is like this amazing figure who's like, the Machiavelli of bleeding Kansas, but you can tell the story without those people without hardly even talking to those people, because it's all of these. It really is a battle that's fought largely by ordinary people, like the whole time. So if you wanted to do a populistic history of it, you probably could. That may be what I'm doing. I don't know. Did I answer that question at all, Jay? All right.
Perfect end to a great homecoming lecture, the first one on our new pulpit. We put our hands together for Joseph. A good start to the homecoming weekend. Please join us for our reception out there. No matter what happens tomorrow, the Tigers are going to win. Remember that.